Should be an interesting read. 1934. So for the first time in two generations, the American people are faced with the primary issue of humanity and all government, the issue of human liberty, not only in the United States, but throughout the world. The whole philosophy of individual liberty is under attack. In haste to bring under control the sweeping social forces unleashed by the political and economic dislocations of world war, by the tremendous advances in productive technology during the last quarter century, by the failure to march with a growing sense of justice, peoples and governments are blindly wounding, even destroying those fundamental human liberties which have been the foundation and the inspiration of progress since the Middle Ages. There we go. Later, about 10 a.m. Kefir and I, a nut seed bar thing I make. Fabulous. Fabulous. It says the great question before the American people is not whether these dislocations and abuses can be mastered and these new and powerful forces organized and directed to human welfare, but whether they can be organized by free men. We have to determine now whether, under the pressures of the hour, we must cripple or abandon the heritage of liberty for some new philosophy which must mark the passing of freedom. Who may define liberty? It is far more than independence of a nation. It is not a catalog of political quote unquote rights. Liberty is a thing of the spirit, to be free to worship, to think, to hold opinions, and to speak without fear, free to challenge wrong and oppressed with surety of justice. Liberty conceives that the mind and spirit of men can be free only if the individual is free to choose his own calling, to develop his talents, to win and to keep a home sacred from intrusion, to rear children in ordered security. It holds he must be free to earn, to spend, to save, to accumulate property that may give protection in old age and to loved ones. It holds both in principle and in world experience that these intellectual and spiritual freedoms cannot thrive except where there are also these economic freedoms. It insists equally upon protections to all these freedoms, or there is no liberty, capital L. It therefore holds that no man, no group may infringe upon the liberties of others. It demands freedom from frozen barriers of class and equal opportunity for every boy and girl to win that place in the community to which their abilities and character entitle them. It holds that these liberties and securities to constructive initiative and enterprise alone assure the immense need of material, moral, and spiritual achievements of men. There are stern obligations upon those who hold these liberties: self-restraint, insistence upon truth, order and justice, vigilance of opinion, and cooperation in the common welfare. Amen. In every generation, men and women of many nations have died that the human spirit may be thus free. In our race, at Plymouth Rock, at Lexington, at Valley Forge, at Yorktown, at New Orleans, at every step of the western frontier, at Gettysburg, at San Juan Hill, in Argonne, are the graves of Americans who died for this purpose. From these sacrifices and in the consummation of these liberties, there grew a great philosophy of society, liberalism. The high tenet of this philosophy is that liberty is an endowment from the Creator of every individual man and woman upon which no power, whether economic or political, can encroach, that not even the government may deny. And herein it challenges all other philosophies of society and government. For all others, both before and since, insist that the individual has no such unalienable rights, that he is but the servant of the state. Liberalism holds that man is master of the state, not the servant. that the sole purpose of government is to nurture and assure these liberties. All others insist that liberty is not a God-given right, that the state is the master of the man. Herein, in the widest divergence of social and governmental concepts known to mankind, no man long holds his freedom under a government which claims men's liberties. That government cannot exist or continue unless it be of despotic powers. The whole of human experience has shown that. And this devotion to freedom is not an abstraction, for liberalism holds that it is solely through the release of the constructive instincts and aspirations of man that society may move forward to its primary purpose. That high purpose is human betterment. Its distinction in American life is its ideal for betterment of all the people. Out of our philosophy grew the American constitutional system, where the obligation to promote the common welfare was mandatory and could be made effective, wherein was embodied in its very framework the denial of the right of government itself or of any group, any business, or any class to infringe upon essential liberties, wherein the majority was to rule, wherein government was to be, quote, of laws and not of men, whereby the individual was guaranteed the just protection of these rights by its tribunals, the structure of American democracy. Out of these ideals, under this philosophy, and through this structure, we have developed the principles and forms of our social, economic, and governmental life, the American system. The rise of our race under it marks the high tide of 1,000 years of human struggle. Upon it, our country has grown to greatness and has led the world in the emancipation of men. When these boundaries of liberty are overstepped, America will cease to be American. From the creativeness of mankind's liberated mind and spirit has come the host of ideas, discoveries, and inventions with their freight of comforts and opportunities. And with all of them has come a burden of different problems to liberty. Today, these complexities add to the aftermath of war, loom large, and the voices of discouragement join with the voices of other social faiths to assert that an irreconcilable conflict has arisen in which liberty must be sacrificed upon the altar of the machine age. But liberty is a living force, expanding to every new vision of humanity, and from its very dynamic freedom of mind and thought comes the conquest of its ceaseless problems. Our system has at all times had to contend with internal encroachments upon liberty. Greed in economic agencies invades it from the right, and greed for power in bureaucracy and government infringes it from the left. It battles against betrayal of trust, business exploitation, and all forms of economic tyranny have long demonstrated that it was no system of laissez-faire. It battles against the spoil system or the expansion of bureaucracy have long demonstrated its live sense of opposition to the subtle approach of political tyranny. I should indeed be glad to find a shortcut to end the immensities of human problems. I have no word of criticism, but rather great sympathy with those who honestly search human experience and human thought for some easy way out. Where human selfishness has no opportunities, where freedom requires no safeguards, where justice requires no striving, where bread comes without contention and with little sweat. Such dreams are not without value, and one could join in them with satisfaction, but for the mind troubled by recollection of human frailty, the painful human advance through history, the long road which humanity still has to travel to economic and social perfections, and but for the woeful confirmations which the world has given of the failure of idealism alone without the compass of experience. It is now claimed by large and vocal groups, both in and out of government, that liberty has failed, that emergency encroachments upon its principles should be made permanent. Thereby are created the most urgent issues. First, whether we must submit to some other system by which the fundamentals of liberty are sacrificed. And second, whether even if we make these sacrifices, we shall not defeat the hope and progress of humanity. These are not partisan issues. They are the greatest issues of American life. Here we go. Haha. I had no sound at the start. Oh, so sorry. Missed the book, but sounds spot on our times. Can you give the title again, please? Sure. It is called The Challenge to Liberty. The Challenge to Liberty by Herbert Hoover, who is looked at as a subpar president of our country at this time. But when I've read this book before, and it's, in my opinion, very good, very good. So, but I feel like it's fitting. Yeah, Herbert Hoover, 1934. So, yeah, World War II, before World War II. Yeah. So, very interesting. Very interesting. So, let's see. I should indeed be glad to find a shortcut to end the immensities of human problems. I have no word of Christmas. Oh, that's right. Advance. Let's see. Idealism alone. It's absolutely fitting. Yeah. Yeah. Let's see. I should indeed be glad to find a problem to I'm sorry. I should indeed be glad to find a shortcut to end the immensities of human problems. I have no word of criticism, but rather great sympathy with those who honestly search human experience and human thought for some easy way out. Where human selfishness has no opportunities, where freedom requires no safeguards, where justice requires no striving, where bread comes without contention and with little sweat. Such dreams are not without value, and one could join in them with satisfaction, but for the mind troubled by recollection of human frailty, the painful human advance through history, the long road which humanity still has to travel to economic and social perfections, and but for the woeful confirmations which the world has given of the failure of idealism alone without the compass of experience. It is now claimed by large and vocal groups, both in and out of government, that liberty has failed, that emergency encroachments upon its principles should be made permanent. Thereby are created the most urgent issues. First, whether we must submit to some other system by which the fundamentals of liberty are sacrificed, and second, whether even if we make these sacrifices, we shall not defeat the hope and progress of humanity. These are not partisan issues. They are the greatest issues of American life. It is my hope to show that to resume the path of liberty is not to go backward. It is definitely to choose the sole path of progress instead of following the will-o'-the-wisps, which lead either to the swamps of primitive greed or to political tyranny. The hope of America and the world is to regenerate liberty with its responsibilities and its obligations, not to abandon it. Amen. Amen. On other occasions, I have commented upon the perversion and assumption of the term liberalism by theories of every ilk, whether national regimentation, fascism, socialism, communism, or whatnot. I pointed out that these philosophies are the very negation of American liberalism. Liberalism is not the possession of any political party. The belief in liberalism, the acceptance of it as a positive philosophy, does not designate a person either as a Republican or a Democrat any more than does his belief in Christianity. It is the purpose of this examination, therefore, upon behalf of human liberty, to survey briefly the moment of revolution through the world since the Great War, and the method of overflow of liberalism. To recall our American heritage, the growth of our liberty, the forces in human nature and human behavior which govern economic life, the restraints and ideals of the system of ordered liberty, the achievements of the American system, to analyze from an American point of view the alternate systems of society, to examine our own abuses of liberty, to review the purposes of American life, to consider constructively not a detailed program, but the method through which alone we can solve national problems. The creed of liberty could be shortly and simply stated. but the complexity of material life and, above all, the immensity of the issue today necessitate its exhaustive examination and from many angles. It may be felt that there are occasional repetitions of tests, but if we make a searching examination, we must review many events, many problems, and many proposals with the same lamp. Amen. With the ordinary or technical economic or governmental problems, important as they are, I shall be here concerned only incidentally as they affect liberty. It is enough for one brief book. It is enough for one brief book to outline their political and social repercussions. This is the last page of the introductions on what is above all the crucial consideration that is liberty itself. Last two paragraphs say, over a period of 20 years, I have been honored by my country with positions where contention with the forces of social disintegration was my continued duty. I should be untrue to that service did I not raise my voice in protest, not at reform, but at the threat of the eclipse of liberty. Nor is it my purpose to criticize individual men. This is solely an issue and will be met by honest men as an issue. For once again, the United States of America faces the test whether, quote, a nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. Fascinating. All right, chapter 1. It says revolutions from liberty. Good morning, everybody. Some 12 years ago, after 7 years of intimate and poignant participation in the backwash of war and revolution, I published a small book on the development and ideals of American individualism. That essay was devoted to a survey of the American system from the point of view of the individual, in contrast with the individual under other social philosophies, rather than to the broader aspect of government. At that time, the scene was the post-war sweep of revolution over 1/3 of the world. Great theories spun by dreamers to remedy pressing human ills then had come to the front of men's minds. Magic formulas had sprung to life with the promise of dissolving all troubles. Great masses of people had flocked to these new banners in hopes born of misery and despair. And as the storm of war and revolution and overwrought emotions subsided, there was left with us of the United States, even then, much unrest, much discontent with the sure forces of human advancement. In that essay, I stated that to all of us, out of this crucible of actual poignant individual experience had come a depth of new understanding. It was for all of us to ponder these new currents if we were to shape our future with intelligence. After recounting the great social philosophies which then were struggling for ascendancy in prostrated Europe, the essay continued. The partisans of some of these other brands of social schemes challenge us to comparison. And some of these partisans, even among our own people, are increasing in their agitation that we adopt one or another or parts of their devices in place of our tried individualism. Good morning, Uganda. Good morning. Uganda's in the house. Good morning to you, friend. They insist that our social foundations are exhausted, that like feudalism and autocracy, America's plan has served its purpose, that it must be abandoned. These are those who have been left in sober doubt of our institutions or are confounded by bewildering catchwords or vivid phrases. For in this welter of discussions, there is much attempt to glorify or defame social and economic forces with phrases. Nor indeed should we disregard the potency of some of these phrases in their stir to action. For myself, let me say at the very outset that my faith in the essential truth, strength, and vitality of the developing creed by which we have hitherto lived in this country of ours has been confirmed and deepened by the searching experiences of 7 years of service in the backwash and miseries of war. Humanity has had another 12 years of racking experience since that essay was written. From the furnaces of war, it has been plunged into the furnaces of economic disorder. The lingering effects of the stupendous destruction of the war, the economic dislocations of the peace, the vast speculation founded on the increasing effort to avoid payment of both private and public debt through inflation and manipulation of currencies, the efforts to make some other nation pay governmental debts, the explosive fuel of nationalism, the unassimilated scientific discoveries and inventions, all these have brought the Great Depression with its vast unemployment and untold misery. Stupendous problems have been thrust upon us for which our social system is blamed rather than the shocks of war and of its peace. The overcoming of these immediate emergencies has much delayed the solutions of the world's constant problems of progress. Still more new social philosophies has sprung to life in these 12 years. Further tests of the older ones have been grained in these fierce crucibles of human experience. Fascism, Nazism have come into actual being. New utopias have been invented. New slogans and phrases have led great masses of suffering people first this way and then that. New revolutions have burned over peoples and even swept again over old burned fields. The revolutions of democracy from autocratic governments in a large part of the civilized world, which were the first products of war, have now been mostly reversed. In many other countries, also revolutions have replaced older liberal governments by so-called quote-unquote authoritarian governments. That is near dictatorship or dictatorship. Is either near dictatorship or dictatorship until far less of humanity enjoys the blessings of freedom that a score of years ago. But beyond all this, liberalism is now under beleaguered attack, even in the great countries of its origin. The reason why I'm reading this book kind of put me off was how Canada, the president of Canada, made emergency powers and has basically now become authoritarian just because a bunch of truckers were against vaccine mandates. So I was very proud of the Canadian people to peacefully protest the proper way, way better than Black Lives Matter and Antifa, but of just civil disobedience, which was a beautiful thing. But now Trudeau has looked at them as terrorists. He has called his own citizens terrorists for disagreeing against vaccine mandates. So watch out. Canada is now authoritarian and has a dictator. So these modern revolutions do not necessarily imply civil war or the killing of people. They more often force back the weakened liberal institutions by clipping, bending, or atrophying of the old frameworks into new forms and purposes. Revolution in government is a hard term to define. Too often we use it colloquially for normal change. Any definition of revolution in democracies implies something more than the peaceful fruition of these philosophies and ideals matured by honest discussion and submitted to the ballot. Excuse me. It means some violent wrench in the whole philosophy of a people. A wrench from their ideals and ideals whence sprang their institutions and their form of government. In many democratic states, it has meant the imposition of a new philosophy, changed ideas and changed ideals without their open submission to the people, and often without the people recognizing its approach until it has become a reality. And not a few of these recent revolutions have been stimulated by ambitious men preying upon the suffering of humanity for personal power. There we go. Absolutely. My cousin was down in Ottawa. It was so peaceful. Australia, New Zealand, the same, and many European countries. The world is changing. I hope so. I'm glad people are standing up for their personal liberties. That's what this book is. The Challenge to Liberty, written in 1934 by President Herbert Hoover. An analysis of these foreign revolutions away from democracy reveals different sequences and methods in different countries, but they have a common pattern varying only in degree and violence of action. Their mild form is the breaking down of confidence in existing institutions by defamation. Their violent form is overthrow of these institutions through seizure or suppression. Ain't that the truth? They vary between the initial winning of elections through promises not intended of fulfillment and the direct, quote unquote, postponement or abolition of elections. They gently secure the amiable surrender of the independence of legislative bodies by the delegation of their powers for, quote unquote, emergency's sake. Isn't that crazy? 1934, emergency's sake. And that's what the president of Canada is saying. It's he enacted this emergency sake, and or else these bodies are harshly reorganized or adjourned. So basically he invoked martial law, is what we call it here in the States, martial law. And so it's a shame, an absolute shame. Anyways, they encroach by evasion and subtle intimidation of judicial independence, or they suppress the courts. In combating criticism, their methods range between manipulation of the agencies of public information and the suppression of free speech and free press, also which Canada does not have as strong as the United States has had and is written to have. These revolutions often enough continue old governmental forms for appearance's sake, but they all move forward to destruction of liberty by the growth of disguised or open dictatorship. None of the whole gamut of these new social ideas can be imposed without play upon fear or intimidation. They cannot be imposed, nor can they be administered, except through the harsh curbing of freedom. For some men always resist the reduction of their liberties. Thus, the scene of the tragedy of liberty the world over must be suffering and discontent among the people. The drama moves swiftly in a torrent of words in which real purposes are disguised in portrayals of utopia, idealism without realism, slogans, phrases, and statements destructive to confidence in existing institutions, demands for violent action against slowly curable ills. Unfair representation that sporadic, this is the last paragraph of this chapter, unfair representation that sporadic wickedness is the system itself, searing prejudice against the former order, dismay and panic in the economic organization, which feeds on its own despair. Emotions rise above reason, the man on horseback ascending triumphantly to office on the steps of constitutional process, demands and threatens the parliament into the delegation of its sacred power. Then follows consolidation of authority through powerful propaganda in the pay of the state to transform the mentality of the people, resentment of criticism, denunciation of all oppositions, moral terrorism, all follow in sequence. The last scene in the suppression of her freedom. Liberty dies of the water from her own well. Free speech poisoned by untruth. Wow. In the epilogue, the dreams of those who saw utopia are shattered, and the people find they are marching backward toward the Middle Ages as regimented men. That's fascinating. That is absolutely fascinating. All right, so that's chapter 1 of The Challenge to Liberty, written in 1934. Chapter 1 specifically was titled Revolutions from Liberty. Now we are in chapter 2, Our American Heritage. Our American Heritage. It may be tiresome to impatient spirits, but in view of the forces moving both abroad and at home, which threaten freedom, every American may well spend a moment on the origins of his liberties, their development, their ideals, and their present vitality to solve our national problems. The philosophy of liberty had its beginnings when freedom of mind and spirit awoke from the Middle Ages in the Renaissance and the Reformation. It became positive in its expression through our English forebears at Runnymede in the enactment of the habeas corpus and in provision for control of taxation by elected representatives of the people. Shout out England. Got a shout out to England here. The migration of our forefathers to America was in refuge from the continued regimentation of men and men's minds still frozen by classes, by feudalism, by the churches, and by governments. Liberty was already implicit in their religious beliefs and their spiritual aspirations. Their purpose was to establish it in government. For the American Revolution was not alone a struggle for national independence. Our forefathers were equally insistent that they were fighting for a new liberty of men. Their ideas were expressed currently, quote, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, quote. And they shock the world by denial of the divine rights of kings. They refuse to be satisfied with the Constitution until it more amply defined these unalienable rights than by the implications of its text. They introduced in the First Amendments a concrete definition of the guarantees of liberty for the individual by declaring, among other things, that there should be no governmental or any other interference in the freedom of worship, of speech, of the press, of peaceable assembly, of petition, no invasion of the security of their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures, and then only by warrant of law. Fascinating. Good morning, everybody. It says, they insisted that a person accused of crime should have the right of speedy and public trial by an impartial jury that should be informed of the charge, that he should have the right to call witnesses and be assisted by counsel, that he should not be compelled in any criminal case to bear witness against himself, that he should not be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And that private property should not be taken for public use without just compensation. Later on in our history, after the Civil War, by further amendments, these rights and immunities were reinforced by freedom from slavery and by still further guarantees of equality before the law and in franchise. Later, by amendment, the franchise was extended to women. Thus, our system is built not only upon declared rights and securities, but upon an equality of these rights to all. In the field of government, the fathers, as the consequence of the philosophy of liberty, devised a mechanism of self-government under a charter of fundamental law designed for the sole purpose of protecting and defending this freedom. Our federal constitution was based upon the conception that the safeguard of free men rested upon explicit law, and that the law should spring from the express will of the majority of the people themselves. The unique feature of its framework was the independence of the executive, legislative, and judicial powers. The checks and balances between state and federal authority, which should guarantee and sustain these rights and liberties, quote, to the end that it may be government of laws and not of men, end quote. They set up machinery for its amendments that would require time to stop, look, and listen in order that transient emotions might cool in the expectation that, recalling its transcendent purpose, the people should be slow to abrogate their liberties. The purpose, the hope, and the prayer of the founders of the Republic was, quote, to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, end quote. They reinforced our frame of government by dual responsibility. On the one hand, through the federal government to maintain our freedom among nations, and with its immense resources and power to protect our people in the event of failure of local government from internal suffering or disorder. On the other hand, under guarantees from federal government, the states were to preserve individual liberty through the responsibilities of local self-government. Really exciting stuff here. I love it. I don't know. I think it's good. It's well put together. Oh, here's the last paragraph of chapter 2. It says, thus, our American Republic was the first of the modern nations to place into the structure of government the whole social philosophy of liberty and its care for the worth and integrity of the individual, with its security of unalienable rights, human rights. Thereby came the emancipation of the lives and minds of American men and women into the mastery of their own destinies. For they were the masters of the state, not the state the master of men. Therefore, thereby they gave the light of freedom to the whole new world and a workable system of government for its protection. Our fathers died willingly that we might come into this, the most stupendous inheritance men could bequeath to a race. Fascinating. Fascinating. Chapter 3 is the utility and ideals of liberty. All right, the utility and ideals of liberty. Get a sip of the drink. God's good. All right, the utility and ideals of liberty, chapter 3. Ever since the woof of our form of government was woven into the warp of liberty at the revolution, we have been unceasing in our development of that liberty until we have made an American system. Rooted into our soil, ingrained into our lives, it differs in important ways from all the liberal systems of Europe. Therefore, I do not speak of British liberalism or French liberalism. I do not speak of the liberalism of the 18th century or the early Victorians. I speak of American liberalism. It has always been a living creed, advancing to meet the problems of our particular worlds. Got to hit the road. Glad to have tuned in to hear this reading. Thanks, Rick. Sleep well. All right, Rachel, you have a great day over there in Scotland. God bless you, sister. Keep up the good work. Keep up the good work. True American liberalism is not a system of frozen procedures. Its very nature is progressive for its own process stimulant growth. From the very stimulus which freedom gives to man, we have created great problems rising from our expansion over a continent, from a 40 times multiplied population, from the development of a huge industry and commerce, and from defensive war. And growth and changing scenes necessitate growth in the methods of protection to liberty. Constant reform is an essential part of its process, not alone to sweep up the ever-recurring tendency of strong groups to consolidate privilege and of citizens to surrender their liberties for economic gains of hopes. But more importantly, because advancing thought, science, discovery, and invention are constantly imposing new surroundings upon us. Yet until recently, in all of our continuous adjustments, we have preserved the great individual rights with which men were endowed by the Creator. Now have we receded from the constitutional principle that not even government shall trespass upon them? Our American system has ever recognized that the borders between liberty and license, between free speech and slander, order and disorder, enterprise and exploitation, private interest and public interest are difficult to define. But the domain of liberty can be defined by virtue, reason, by the common will, and by law. It cannot be defined by arbitrary power. American liberty, through its enthronement of the individual, has proved over generations to have deep roots both in utility and in human experience. We must examine here some very practical questions, for upon them hinge great issues. Any society to be successful must secure the effort and initiative of its citizens. Otherwise, it will stagnate or degenerate. To meet its needs and to advance its civilization, it must encourage the impulses which motivate the individual to action and achievement. Therefore, any workable philosophy of society or framework of government must take account of the raw materials of human nature from which its motivations of or human drives arise, if it would build for the betterment of the nation. If we examine the characteristics of human nature and human behavior, we find they are mostly born in man and change but slowly. Without attempting to determine relative importance, we find that they comprise certain hereditary human instincts and certain acquired desires. Amen. They are such evil instincts and impulses as shiftlessness, envy, hate, malice, fear, over pugnacity, greed, and will to destruction. These require no discussion except in terms of repression. There are the selfish instincts and impulses of self preservation, acquisitiveness, curiosity, rivalry, ambition, desire for self expression, for adulation, for power. There are the altruistic instincts of courage, love, and fealty to family and to country, of pity, of kindness and generosity, of love of liberty and of justice, the desire to work and construct for expression of creative faculties, the impulse to serve the community and nation, and with these also hope, faith, and the mystical yearnings for spiritual things. All these instincts and qualities vary in proportion in every individual, and their proportions are modified by intelligence, ability, and physical vigor. They are further modified by education, by moral and spiritual training, by the vast fund of human experience, and the vast plant and equipment of civilization, which we pass on with in increments to each succeeding generation. From these instincts, impulses, desires, and characteristics come drive to action, initiative, leadership, production of hand and mind, cooperation, the high development of thought, and spirituality. From them come not alone the forces of progress, but also the injuries to freedom, which range through oppression, crime, and justice. But whatever their division among us, one thing can be stated in finality: instincts, character, and the divine spark in the human soul are the property alone of the individual. There can be no human thought, no impulse to action which does not arise from the individual. A free people maintains as many potential centers of enterprise, leadership, and intellectual and spiritual progress as these are individuals. We might as well talk of abolishing the sun's rays if we would secure our food, as to talk of abolishing individualism as a basis of successful society. Economic laws may be said to be the deduction from human experience of the average response of these varied selfish or altruistic raw materials of the human animal when applied in the mass. These cannot be repealed by official fiat. It is precisely upon the rock of human behavior that the most perfect academic hopes and panaceas are wrecked. Those amateur sociologists who are misleading this nation by ignoring the biological foundations of human action are as far from common sense as an engineer who ignores physics in bridge building. No economic equality can survive the working of biological inequality. This is a hard, commonplace truth, disappointing as it may be to those who ride upon plans of utopia. For at least the next several generations, we dare not wholly abandon self-interest as a component of motive forces to initiative, to enterprise, to leadership. Next paragraph. Out of these complex and powerful instincts and impulses, human experience over generations has developed an economic system. Excuse me. Let me get a sip of my drink. Page 28. Page 28. We're on. Out of these complex and powerful instincts and impulses, human experience over generations has developed an economic system which we may define as one of private property, competitive production, and distribution of goods and services in hope of a profit, the payment of differential wages and salaries based upon abilities and services, the savings of earnings and profits, the lending of them at interest through their investment in our productive plant. This system of rewards to stimulate the creative instincts and impulses which motivate men secures the application of all their infinitely varied energies. Therefore, therefrom comes the transformation of the products of nature and their distribution as the goods and services which provide for the nation. It also secures the self denial, thrift, and savings of a multitude of people which provide the productive capital from which we build our tools and equipment. Through competition, we secure the most potent stimulant to improvement and progress. The manager's restless pillow has done more to advance the practical arts than all the legislation upon the statute books. Competition curbs rapacity and attempts at economic domination. Ours is a system of losses to the least intelligent producers as well as profits to the more intelligent. And while some individuals may at times profit unduly or may abuse liberty, in the end, it is the consumer that wins through the production of the plenty of goods and services. For he is the beneficiary of that increasing production at constantly lower costs, which we require to reach our social objective. In constantly increasing standards of living, excuse me, this system is greatly modified from the raw by the increasing knowledge of what constitutes self interest, but more importantly, by the ideals and standards vital to secure ordered liberty. It has, in many ways, become uniquely American. From unprecedented invention and method, we have developed low unit costs by mass production and by large scale operation. Mass production rests necess- nece- mm, Mass production rests necessarily upon great accumulations of capital from a multitude of savings, and it succeeds by arousing mass desire and mass consumption. In turn, this can be reached only by low unit profit and increasing purchasing power through higher real wages and salaries. Overriding all economic details, it is certain that any hope of conducting this vast complex of civilization and of assuring progress for the future must lie in the development of millions of liberties for leadership in every agency of life, great or small. Leadership cannot be discovered by birth, nor bred like queen bees, nor assured by the appointment of autocrats or bureaucrats. This immense necessity of society can be supplied only from a full recruiting out of the whole mass of the people through the sifting test of competition among free men and women. If there were no other reason, this is the justification of the competitive system, for without its constant renewal of leadership, our increasingly complex civilization will cease properly to function. Moreover, in a broad way, the only individuals who can successfully conduct these millions of organizations which we have created to carry on our daily life are those who have a self interest in the results from them and have risen to leadership in them by their own worth. No civilization could be built to endure solely upon a groundwork of greed or even upon the enlightened self interest of the individual. It is out of the altruistic and constructive impulses that the standards and the ideals of the nation are molded and sustained. Our American system is not alone an economic method, a definition of rights, a scheme of representative government, an organization to maintain order and justice, a release of constructive instincts and desires. It is far more than that, for it is a system of stimulation to higher standards, to higher aspirations and ideals. While we have built a gigantic organized society upon the attainment of the individual, we should not have raised a brick of it, but by the stimulation to self restraint and by drawing upon those high aspirations of men and women expressed in their standards of truth and justice and in their spiritual yearnings. Hello, greetings. Yeah, I got to sleep very early. Good morning, Tina, to you. Went to sleep early, maybe about 7:50. Well, I think I passed out around 7:50 p.m. So woke up and just started doing some reading. So good morning to you, Miss Tina. So yeah, we have built and for the record, this is the Challenge to Liberty, Challenge to Liberty by Herbert Hoover, 1934. While we have built a gigantic organized society upon the attainment of the individual, we should not have raised a brick of it, but by the stimulation to self restraint and by drawing upon those high aspirations of men and women expressed in their standards of truth and justice and in their spiritual yearnings. Amen and amen. These ideals are never wholly realized. Not a single human being personifies their complete realization. Excuse me. It is therefore not surprising that society, a collection of persons, a necessary maze of instincts of individuals, cannot realize its ideals wholly. We may well examine what some of these ideals are. The first concern of the American system is for spiritual health and growth of men. It does not accept that the end and object of civilization or the pursuit of happiness lies in being well fed or growing fat. It denies the economic concept of history. It denies the economic concept of history, or that blind materialism can long engage the loyalties of mankind. Its faith is that the divine spark, the ideals, the conscience, the courage, the patriotism, the heroism, and the humanism of men make human destiny. It holds that freedom. It holds that freedom is a prize to be sought for itself, for from it come the infinite satisfactions of the spirit, far more important than all the goods and gadgets of life. American liberalism holds that moral and spiritual advancement among men can come only through the freedom of individual conscience and opinion, and the responsibilities which of themselves come only in freedom. The very basis of freedom is justice, and our philosophy holds that justice extends further than protection of legal rights, that it extends into those fields of social relations which are outside the law. That at every individual shall be given a fair chance and equality of opportunity. It holds that there should be a just diffusion of national income, which will give protection and security to those who have the will to work. American liberty denies that special privileges come to men by birth. It denies the whole concept of frozen class and of class conflict. For these stratifications and are barriers to the free spirit and the free rise of the individual by his own effort. Amen. The humanism of our system demands the protection of the suffering and the unfortunate. It places that prime responsibility upon the individual for the welfare of his neighbor. But it insists also that in necessity, the local community, the state government, and in the last resort, the national government shall give protection to them. But it also insists that the full exercise of this responsibility by every individual and institution is an essential of sustained liberty. It holds that the very sustenance of liberty and the hope of humanity is in cooperation. It holds that this cooperation may be promoted by government, but to liberty, cooperation is a concept of consent among free men, not the compulsion of regimented men. There we go. It says it holds that the other freedoms cannot be maintained if economic freedom is impaired. Excuse me. Not alone because the most insidious mastery of men's minds and lives is through economic domination, but because the maximum possible economic freedom is the most nearly universal field for release of the creative spirit of men. It has ever held that injury to others is an encroachment upon liberty, and that restraints as well as freedoms are the very rights of men. Therefore, in fashioning its economic system, it does not hold that there is a license of business to exploit. On the contrary, it holds that economic oppression is servitude. The American system holds equally the monopoly, group, or class advantage, economic domination, regimentation, fascism, socialism, communism, or any other form of tyranny, small or great, are violations of the basis of liberty. True liberty requires that all claims to human power must be subject to live criticism and the common judgment. The primary protections of humanity from oppressions, either by private action or by government, are the liberties of expression and protest. Ours is the sole system which maintains with itself the forces of corrective antagonism to oppression of any kind, whether they come from the right or the left. We may justifiably say that our system builded on liberty stimulates those constructive instincts and aspirations through which men and women develop their individual capabilities to the maximum achievement, and that the sum of such achievements is far greater than that possible under any system which stultifies these desires and aspirations. In essence, it's justice, self restraint, obligation to fellow men. Its practice is a sensitive judgment. I'm sorry. Its practice is a sensitive adjustment of conflicting rights and interests through a spirit of decency and cooperation in human relationships, reinforced by governmental restraints to the end that men may enjoy equal opportunities. It has proved the broadest road and the surest to human progress. Hardly 20 years ago, we accepted our liberties as we accepted the air we breathed. We burned incense to those forefathers who died to win them for us, and to those who devised a government which assured them to us. We were confident of the rightness of our ideals and our institutions, that we would, quote, make the world safe for democracy, end quote. No man thought that no man thought they lay endangered within his lifetime. Yet today, men freely debate how much of these we will surrender. Pretty interesting. Very interesting. So that is the end of chapter 3. This is the utility and ideals of liberty. Let's see here. Yeah, I just read that chapter. Yeah, chapter 3, the utility and ideals of liberty. Very good. All right, so that is the end of chapter 35 and page 35 and chapter 3. Now, chapter 4, the accomplishments of the American system. The chapter 4, the accomplishments of the American system. Signor Mussolini states, quote, today the liberal faith must shut the doors of its deserted temples. Deserted because the peoples of the world realize that its worship, agnostic in the field of economics and indifferent in the field of politics and morals, will lead, as it has already led, to certain ruin. End quote. There you go, Mussolini. We have many voices at home who are likewise informing us that we must change to some other faith. Before we depart from American liberty and plunge into the alternatives urged upon us, we should pause to examine not only the character of its foundations, but its record of attainments and the degree of its quote-unquote ruin. We must do this, although to mention accomplishments of the American system is in these days a perilous adventure, since little of it can be admitted and at the same time justify much of the current oratory. But there does remain a vast majority of our people who are proud of our race, the great epic of its accomplishments, and its stirring spiritual forces of progress. All right, so this is written 1934. It's called The Challenge to Liberty. 1934. Boom. End live video. Share. And then restart. Boom. There we go. All right, we're about an hour into our reading. This is chapter 4, The Accomplishments of the American System. And it's written 1934, The Challenge to Liberty. The strength of a social system for betterment of humanity is to be measured not alone by its ideals and by its practicability, but by its comparison with others, and even more by its record of achievement. It is not to be measured by the arraignment of human weaknesses on its margins, or by contrast with perfection, as variable as the dreams of beatitude truly are. And any appraisal of accomplishment concerns not material progress alone. More importantly, it comprises intellectual, moral, spiritual, and social advancement. We need go back scarcely more than a single generation in this examination, and indeed it is the last generation in national life that is the important period of test, for it is over the last generation and not previous generations, nor a single year or 5 years, that the movement toward present decadence or progress becomes evident. For many years in practice of my profession and in public service, I journeyed to other countries. My occupation was not as a tourist, but as one engaged intimately with those peoples, associated in their daily lives and problems, in contact with their social systems, their governments, their thoughts, their hopes, and their progress. In England, in Germany, in France, in Italy, in Russia, in China, in India, in Latin America, and in Australia alike, the great mass of people viewed the progress and the liberty of America as an ideal. And to me, every homecoming was an inspiration. I found again a greater kindliness, a greater neighborliness, a greater sense of individual responsibility, a lesser poverty, a greater comfort and security of our people, a wider spread of education, a wider diffusion of the finer arts and appreciation of them, a greater freedom of spirit, a wider opportunity for our children, and higher hopes of the future than in any other country in the world. The American system has gone further towards solutions of economic security of the individual than any other system of society. Our diffusion of national income has its faults, but even English liberalism has today doubled the proportion of the people under the real poverty line than we have. Fascism has made improvement in Italy, but at an immeasurable cost of human liberty, and its attainments are far below that what the American system had already accomplished. And we stand in brilliant contrast with the drab failure of the socialist system of production as we see it at work in its great socialist exemplar, Russia. The statistics indicate only the bones of the social body, but they do indicate its strength. If we were to compare the proportions in each thousand of our population with those of the most advanced nation of Europe, we would find some reassuring evidences of our strength. We have a third more of our children a longer time in the primary schools than has that country. We have proportionally 3 times as many in secondary schools. We have over 6 times as many in institutions of higher learning. We have a far wider diffusion among the people of books, magazines, and newspapers than any other country. In proportion to our numbers, we have developed 10 times as many laboratories of scientific research and invention. Our application of scientific discovery has grown at a pace far beyond that of any other nation. While it has increased our problems, yet with the increased productivity from it has come the enlargement of leisure and the extension of constructive recreation. We have come into a fuller life for all of the people, have given increasing scope to creative power and the expansion of every man's mind. More than any other leading country, we had advanced the realities of human justice, not alone in education, but in a vast series of protections to children, to public health, to conditions of labor, and by regulations of business activities, making firm the open door of opportunity. The humanness of our people and our sense of community responsibility had grown steadily. During the past generation, we had more nearly during the past generation, we had more nearly met with a full hand, a most sacred obligation of man, the responsibility of a man to his neighbor. Support to our schools, hospitals, and institutions for the care of the afflicted had surpassed in totals of billions the service in any period of history proportionate to any other nation in the world. Our provisions through community, local, state, and national government for hospitalization for care of those who had met misfortune, our care of orphans, the aged, the victims of storm, flood, and drought were nearing the full need. No finer spirit of a people can be found than has been shown by ours in the universal and untiring support of those in distress from the Depression. We have gained enormously in the sense and method of cooperation, and its moving spirit has had no parallel in any other race. Tens of thousands of associations meet in village and city for the advancement of economic, scientific, moral, and social, professional, and governmental ideas. Through their exchange of ideas, their coordination of action, their lived in standards and ideals, we had greatly developed in the highest area of government, that is, self government outside of formal government. Industry had made its strides in understanding its public obligations and progress in the sense of trusteeship involved in the conduct of corporate life. That understanding has been, on average, higher than those of the other peoples. We have heartbreaking violations, but we demand higher standards than other nations, and we get more irritated and vocal when our standards are not met. Until lately, there was profound improvement in the relation of the employer and the employed. Organized labor had won great advances. As a nation, we had accepted the principle of collective bargaining and that the courts must not be used in its prevention. We had embraced the thesis that payment of the highest real wage was the most effective way to increase economic and social progress, and that industry had a definite obligation to its employees outside of their wage. Labor had in the main rejected Labor had in the main rejected the foreign formulas of limitation of effort. The hours of labor had decreased successively, and the 12-hour, the 11-hour, the 10-hour, and 9-hour day had disappeared. Child labor had decreased by over two-thirds in the 20 years before 1930. Our system of liberty, through its stimulation of competitive individual effort, its creation of enterprise, its development of skill, and its discoveries in science and invention, which come from intellectual freedom, has secured the production of the greatest quantities of commodities and services, and in the most infinite variety known to the history of man. We can say without qualification that the motivation of production based on private initiative had proved the very mother of plenty. Thus, the outstanding accomplishment of our economic system was that for the first time in the history of the world, and almost alone among nations, we produced not only plenty to supply the minimum needs for our whole population for food, clothing, shelter, the protections of government, intellectual development, and recreation, but a larger measure of comforts. The triumph of our degree of the triumph of our degree of economy of plenty over an economy of scarcity represents the highest economic achievement of civilization. It has had visible demonstration in this last generation. In this short period of one generation, and even before the recent boom, the numbers of our families and therefore our homes had increased by 9 million. In that time, we had builded for them 15 million new and better homes. In proportion to each 100,000 of our people, we had equipped 4 times as many homes with electricity as any other great nation. Thereby, we lifted infinite drudgery from women and men. The barriers of time and space had been swept away. Life had been made freer. The intellectual vision of every individual had been expanded by bringing to them, in proportion to our numbers, 4 times as many telephones, 5 times as many radios, and 6 times as many automobiles as any great nation of Europe. Our cities had been made magnificent with beautiful buildings, parks, and playgrounds. Our countryside had been knit together with splendid roads. We had increased by 12 times the use of electric power in industry, and thereby taken the sweat from the backs of men. In this great climb, real wages and the purchasing power of men and women had steadily increased over the generation. Socially, and despite all the theorists, we were steadily lessening any tendency of our people towards social and economic class stratification until the recent stimulation of class feeling. If the socialists, communists, and other collectivists would but compute the farm and home owners, the individual small business people, the insurance policyholders, the savings bank depositors, the small investors, the stockholders, and the employees of secured position and future, they would find us without that dimension of, quote, proletariat, end quote, upon which all their appeals to hate are based. By that term is meant the group in poverty without hope for other than a lifelong sordid grind for bare existence, and without hope for the betterment of their children. Outside of the transitory paralysis of the Great Depression, that group has steadily decreased. In the field, in the field of government, I believe that any careful student will agree that during this generation, the efficiency and integrity of public administration, whether national, state, or municipal, had sensibly improved despite some bad exhibits. our unique American national habit of washing our dirty government linen in public, a habit itself an indication of moral virility, tends to obscure the fact that even our weakest spot in government, the municipalities, had markedly improved our over a generation. The showing of a single American generation after many other generations of steady improvement in human living, this advance of comfort and intellectual life, inspiration, and ideals did not arise without right principles animating the American system with which produced them. But above all other accomplishments, our system was constant in asserting the rights of men against government and domestic tyranny. For ours was a vigorous and vocal opponent of human wrongs. Outstanding, undimmed, and challenging, it was the hope of opportunity and freedom for men and women. 5 years ago, there came the earthquake of worldwide depression from worldwide causes. Businessmen and farmers suffered bitter distress. 3 to 4 million families lost the earnings of their breadwinners. A poverty stalked in the land as we had not known it since the like aftermath of the Civil War. In view of the character of the storm, the nation may thank God that 21 millions of families still had their living. It is one of the greatest testimonies to the staunchness of the structure of American liberty that immediately upon this disaster, the country was organized and giving unfailing food and shelter to those in distress, which through the idealism of the nation, which accepted its responsibilities, and through the sacrifice of those who were kept at work. Manfully, the nation was adjusting the strains of the depression and was accomplishing it without strikes and without social class. And it might be observed through it all that the structure which was builded over these years was not so much in quote ruins, end quote, that it did not produce more goods than bureaucracy could tolerate. That some 30 million children continue to attend school in the quote unquote ruins. That millions of people continue to find spiritual inspiration in churches still standing in the quote unquote ruins. That other millions daily attended games, theaters, and recreations in the quote unquote ruins, and that 23 million automobiles were running about in our ruins at ever increasing speeds. Very interesting. The Depression brought vividly to the surface many failures in American life, many weaknesses latent in the organization of the system, many wickednesses and abuses of liberty. Some of them are far deeper than the Depression. We witness tragedy after tragedy to American aspirations and ideals, abuses of liberty through betrayal of trust or through economic domination, whether they be called, quote, unfair competition, end quote, special privilege, monopoly, exploitation, vicious speculation, or the use of property to oppress others, are all sins against the whole system and ideals of liberty. Thoughtful men had long warned of these weaknesses, but the American people are slow to move by an abstraction. Here indeed has been the battleground of liberty against oppression ever since the beginning of the industrial age. Upon our conceptions of duty, our courage, and our abilities will liberty survive. In the confusion of striving to overcome the depression and the multitude of social and economic problems born of our progress and a wider vision of human betterment, the American system of liberty has been challenged, and the cry has gone up that these problems cannot be solved within its own philosophy and within a frame of government which cannot itself infringe upon liberty. Here is indeed its real test. I shall deal later with the questions of the abuse of liberty and the vitality and the capacity of the true American system to overcome these dangers. But before doing so, I shall discuss the alternative systems which are offered to us today. For, quote, eternal vigilance, end quote, is today not alone a fight against the growth of economic oppressions within our walls, but the invasion of these other systems from without. This is the last page of chapter 4. It says the American people have been greatly discouraged these last 4 years, and in the presence of immediate difficulties have sometimes forgotten the grandeur of our accomplishments, the genius of our hope, the genius of our people, and the future promises of our national life. This is written in 1934, everybody. So during the Depression by President Herbert Hoover. Our present difficulties, great as they are, do not justify the assumption that a system of life builded on such sacrifice over a century and a half with such a record of achievement should be discarded or crippled, or that the philosophy of liberty is all wrong, or even that, we quote, must sacrifice some of our liberties, end quote, for this period is no more typical of the American system than all the other aftermaths of war in the previous century, or than all the other bubbles of crazy inflation in history. Haha. Last paragraph says of chapter 4 in this book, The Challenge to Liberty. It is not as if this were a mere machine that we are contemplating for. Mind you, in America, we are dealing with one of the last few strongholds of human freedom. Its liberties did not come to us as a gift. They were bought by the blood of men who fought for them. Amen. Chapter 5. Alternative philosophies of society and government. We may briefly examine the other social philosophies which are today offered as a challenge to our American system. Those which rise to importance in discussion are socialism, communism, fascism, Nazism, and national regimentation. They all have in common the idea of the servitude of the individual to the state and the denial of liberties unassailable by the state. Haha. There are other systems which have arisen in the past: theocracy, patriarchy, oligarchy, autocracy, despotism, monarchy, feudalism. They likewise held to this common idea that men are the servants and pawns of the state, and most of them sheltered their omnipotence over human rights in the claim of divine right. Some of these old systems still linger in places in the world, but they have no present importance to us except as laboratory records of human experience. It is rather a remarkable fact that while the alternative systems of society which are proposed to us have organized exponents who expound their philosophy, their ideals, their patterns, their methods, their promises, and their superiorities. We have little definite exposition of the philosophy, purpose, attainments, and the objectives of true American liberalism. A primary difficulty in any discussion of social philosophies is a definition of words and terms. They are not often defined alike by friends and foes, or even among friends. That is perhaps natural, for each contains many ideas and consequences which can be given different weights in expounding their ideologies. There is also a large element of quote unquote slogan and opprobrium opprobrium in their use. The exponents of each assign most of the beatitudes to their system and all the failures of humanity to the others. We may, however, so far as they are available, adopt the definitions of proponents. Before I proceed to discuss these alternate philosophies of society and government, I shall, in order to clear some underbrush, take a moment to discuss one of the older economic systems, the ghost of which seems to walk the minds of some of our contemporary essayists, that is laissez faire. The old economic theory of the French physiocrats of the 18th century and of its exponent in modified form, Adam Smith, had been lately revived as a vivid slogan, mostly for political defamation. It is the theory of economic let do, go as you please, or let nature rule, and is defined in academic terms as, quote, the doctrine that the businessman should be allowed to go his own way, while the government's only duty is to give him protection and perform a few general services, preserve peace, and punish crime, end quote. This was originally thought to be the essential component of all forms of individualism. It may thrive as an economic or social philosophy in some country today, but it has been dead in America for generations, except in books of economic history. It is now, however, trotted out and forms a comforting political invective for use by a long list of collectivists, writers who infer that it dominated and directed the policies of the United States up to some recent date when it was suddenly vanquished and abandoned. Another term associated by some with laissez faire is capitalism. This again is a term of indefinite meaning depending upon who uses it. It is employed by the enemies of the American system for purposes of slur. The American economic system is hardly one of let do and go as you please. Ever since the industrial age began, we have devised and enforce thousands of regulations in prevention of economic domination or abuse of our liberties through the growing instruments of business. Furthermore, the sense of public responsibility for the general welfare has successively produced public education, public health, public works, public stimulation of scientific research, and in 1929, for the first time, embraced the responsibility for public action in the battle against depression. This is hardly laissez faire. If our economic system was abandoned at some recent date, as some persons purport, then we must face the only alternatives, the consequences of one of the others of regimentation, fascism, socialism, or communism. If it, excuse me, regimentation, fascism, socialism, or communism. If its marginal weaknesses are to be reformed, as they constantly must be, then that is neither revolution nor abandonment. Some 12 years ago, in the essay referred to before, I expressed this view. Individualism cannot be maintained as the foundation of a society if it looks to only legalistic justice based upon contracts, property, and political equality. Such legalistic safeguards are themselves not enough. In our individualism, we have long since abandoned the laissez faire of the 18th century. The notion that it is, quote, every man for himself and the devil take the hindmost, end quote. We abandoned that when we adopted the ideal of equality of opportunity, the fair chance of Abraham Lincoln. We have confirmed its abandonment in terms of legislation of social and economic justice, in part because we have learned that social injustice is the destruction of justice itself. We have learned that the impulse to production can only be maintained at a high pitch if there is a fair division of the product. We have also learned that fair division can only be obtained by certain restrictions on the strong and the dominant. I have not, in the period of 12 years since, heard this idea disputed by any economist, sociologist, businessman, politician, or statesman. There may be some reactionary souls who still yearn for laissez-faire, but the lack of objection to the above statement might indicate that it has no passionate party in its support. It had passed out of living and thought, but has since been reborn in the past 12 months only as a dishonest polemic, as a straw man set up to be knocked down. Every decent American and every sincere defender of the accomplishments of our people and the inherent soundness of their character and beliefs resents the change that every wickedness in high place is because of our devotion to laissez-faire. These horrid examples quoted to us daily are mostly violations of simple honesty or actions through the loopholes of law and the Ten Commandments, and are not the basis of our economic or social system. If they were, we should have perished some generations ago. While discussing defamation of economic or social ideas, I might also spend a few lines upon the term rugged individualism. End quote. This term is lately clothed in false habiliments of heartless disregard of public welfare and daily demolished with hot invective. Yet to maintain the varied individuality and personality of men and women is one of the assurances of progress. We have predicated our entire educational system and our entire social advancement upon the development of the special qualities of individuals, their personality and character. While I can make no claim for having introduced the term rugged individualism, I should be proud to have invented it. Should be proud to have invented it. It has been used by American leaders for over a half a century in eulogy of those God fearing men and women of honesty whose stamina and character and fearless assertion of rights led them to make their own way in life. It is they who have borne the burdens and given leadership in their communities. Rugged individualism is indeed a distinguishing and enduring quality ever found among Americans. It gives lifeblood to such basic principles as freedom of speech, conscience, press, and equality before the law. Regardless of race or religion, it contributes. You have been logged out. Instagram just cut me off. That's weird. Okay, cool. And yeah, all right, cool. Instagram just shut me off. All right, blah 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 blah. Rights led them to make their own way in life. It is they who have borne the burdens and given leadership in their communities. Rugged individualism is indeed a distinguishing and enduring quality ever found among Americans. It gives lifeblood to such basic principles as freedom of speech, conscience, press, and equality before the law, regardless of race or religion. It contributes to the saving of our souls and character. Quote from the deadening pressure of conformity and false ideals. All right, the next section is on socialism. So I'll pick back up there next time. I'm on page 55. So we'll say with my pen, it says today is February 15th, 2022. And we're going to say read pages 1 through 55 of The Challenge to Liberty. The Challenge to Liberty by Herbert Hoover. Herbert Hoover, 1934. Excellent. All right, cool. So that's been fun. Begin at socialism. All right, excellent. All right, cool. Well, thanks for tuning in. Appreciate everybody hopping on to read The Challenge to Liberty. A good read. Good discussion. Appreciate Rachel being on from Edinburgh, Scotland. Appreciate Derek being on from Uganda and some of my American friends as well. Good to have you. Hope you all have a good rest of your night/morning. And I'll be back on in 4 hours doing some Bible reading. All right. Talk to you later. All right, cool. So there we go. YouTube, thanks for tuning in. God bless you guys. That is 1 hour and 28 minutes of reading. Talk to you later.